Dr. Evelyn Reed stood in the center of the courtroom, eyes unwavering, not a hint of hesitation in her stance. Before her, Prosecutor Marcus Thorne slammed a thick stack of documents onto the table, his cold voice cutting through the tense silence. Dr. Reed, tell the jury, how does someone with no academic background or experience manage to secure the position you're in? Or is it possible your entire life has been one big lie? The courtroom erupted. Flashbulbs from cameras went off in rapid succession, journalists scribbling furiously. Outside, scandalous headlines flashed across news screens. The greatest fraud of the century. Mysterious woman exposed. But Evelyn remained unfazed. She knew the truth, but if she revealed it, the entire nation could be at risk. What would happen if her true identity was uncovered? Who is she really? And why does the government seem to be leaving her to fight this battle alone? Join me as we uncover the mystery behind this explosive case. If you love dramatic twists and jaw-dropping surprises, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay up to date with every shocking detail. The wooden gavel struck down with a sharp, dry thud, reverberating through the eerily silent courtroom. Soft amber lights cast a stern glow on Judge Arthur Finch's face, but all eyes in the room were fixed on the man standing up from the prosecutor's table. Marcus Thorne, an ambitious prosecutor in a perfectly tailored black suit, cleared his throat and swept his gaze over the jury before speaking words that would explode the trial wide open. Dr. Evelyn Reed is a fraud, and her entire life has been a deceit. The words cut through the air like a razor blade, making the tension in the room almost suffocating. A beat of silence followed, as if the world itself had come to a halt, before the courtroom erupted into chaos. Flashbulbs blazed, reporters scrambled to capture every moment, and cameras zoomed in on the woman standing in the defendant's box. Evelyn Reed remained still, her deep eyes unwavering, as if the accusations held no weight. She wasn't surprised, nor was she frightened. All she did was observe quietly. Dozens of gazes were locked on her, each one filled with different emotions: curiosity, anger, disbelief. Some had already made up their minds, labeling her a con artist who had deceived America for years. Others held back, waiting to see how she would respond. But no one knew that behind her calm, almost cold exterior, a storm was brewing. Evelyn wasn't afraid of the accusations, but she knew this wasn't just a trial. This was a battle where she could lose everything, even her life. Marcus Thorne stepped forward, holding a thick stack of papers, raising them in front of the jury like a trophy. These documents prove that Evelyn Reed never attended any of the universities she claimed. No records at Harvard, no certifications from MIT. It's all a lie, carefully crafted to cover up one truth: that she built her career on a foundation of fraud. Once again, the room descended into chaos. Some jury members frowned, while others exchanged doubtful glances. The reporters below eagerly scribbled their notes, and the audience watching the live broadcast was no doubt buzzing with theories. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her lips pressed together. She had anticipated this moment, but the relentless assault still left her feeling claustrophobic. She knew exactly why no one could find her records. They hadn't been lost, they'd been erased, and not by her. All her credentials, every record of her life, had been buried by the government, hidden beneath layers of classified files. She could easily turn the tide by revealing the truth, but if she did, not only would she suffer the consequences, but many others would too. The lives of those who had worked with her, the covert operations she'd been involved in, everything would be thrust into the light, and she couldn't let that happen. Dr. Reed, do you have anything to say? Prosecutor Thorne's voice cut through the tension, laced with challenge. He stood in front of her, eyes sharp as a predator's. Evelyn slowly turned her gaze towards him, but remained silent. A wave of impatience swept over the courtroom. A white woman sitting at the back of the room shook her head in disappointment, while a reporter whispered to a colleague, "If she has nothing to say, then she's guilty, right?" A faint smile appeared on Evelyn's lips. She had faced hundreds of interrogations, stood in front of far more dangerous adversaries than Thorne, and had never once lost her composure. He thought he had the upper hand, but he didn't know he had only scratched the surface of the story. She leaned forward slightly, placing both hands on the table, her fingers interlacing calmly. "Mr. Thorne, you seem quite confident about the evidence in your hands. But tell me, if my records truly don't exist, why am I sitting here in front of you as one of the nation's leading experts in national security?" A ripple of murmurs swept through the courtroom. Thorne furrowed his brow but quickly regained his composure. "What are you trying to say, Dr. Reed?" Evelyn shrugged, her gaze cutting through him like a knife. "I'm just wondering, if my life really is a lie, then who allowed me to go this far? And why has the government allowed this to happen for so many years?" The room fell into silence, but this time it wasn't eager anticipation, it was confusion. Suddenly, questions began to form in the minds of everyone. If Evelyn was truly a fraud, how had she managed to pass through multiple security checks to hold such important positions? Why hadn't the government caught her earlier? Evelyn leaned back in her chair, her gaze never faltering. She knew this was just the beginning. The real battle was still ahead, and she had to brace herself for the attacks to come. But one thing she was sure of, she wasn't going down without a fight. Outside the courthouse, the air was so thick with tension it felt like it could be sliced into pieces. Angry crowds gathered on the sidewalk, holding high signs with bold red letters, "Bring back justice. Don't let a liar fool America." The shouts echoed through the square, bouncing off the cold stone steps leading into the courthouse. Police officers stood in tight rows, their hands ready on their belts, prepared to control the crowd if things got out of hand. But no one could stop the fury burning in the hearts of the public. To them, Evelyn Reed wasn't just a defendant, she was a symbol of deceit, of a system that had allowed a fraud to rise to power. The camera panned across the face of a middle-aged man in a worn coat, his voice hoarse from shouting. "She's lied to all of us. A person with no credentials, no clear records, and yet she somehow lands a high position in the government? How could this happen without someone backing her up?" Beside him, a blonde woman holding a phone and live-streaming shouted into the screen, "Look at this. This is proof the system has been manipulated. If someone like Evelyn Reed can fool the government, then who's responsible for this?" News headlines flashed continuously on the massive LED screen above a building across from the courthouse, with eye-catching headlines changing every second. Education records erased. Could this be the greatest fraud in history? Evelyn Reed, genius or con artist? A national threat. The suspicious journey of a woman without a past. Evelyn stepped down the courthouse steps, her gaze sweeping over the chaotic scene unfolding before her. From where she stood, she could see hundreds of people, enraged by a story they didn't know the full details of. They believed what the media had said. They believed the narrative the prosecutor had constructed, that she was an imposter, that she had deceived all of America. But they didn't know the truth was never as simple as that. She looked up at a large screen nearby, where a television program was dissecting her case. A serious-looking host said, "If Evelyn Reed truly doesn't have any records, how was she able to pass security checks and hold such important positions? Whose fault is that? And more importantly, if she has something to hide, what is it?" Another commentator shook their head. "There are too many mysteries surrounding her. The real question is, can we trust the government if they've allowed someone like this to exist for so long?" The crowd continued to chant angry slogans, their voices hitting Evelyn like invisible blows, but she didn't react. No one in this crowd knew that the truth was far more complicated. It wasn't that she didn't have records, it was that those records had been buried, hidden by the very people they trusted. They thought they were seeking justice, but in reality, they were pawns in a game they couldn't fully understand. Evelyn knew there was no way to convince them right now because sometimes the truth isn't what people want to hear. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick and oppressive, as if the very air had been drained of oxygen. Every person in the room was fixated on Evelyn, awaiting a response, any reaction, any excuse, any hint of panic that could confirm the allegations against her. But she remained composed, not offering them a single shred of what they expected. Marcus Thorne seized the opportunity. He moved closer, his voice resonating through the room with chilling certainty, his words designed to break Evelyn down. "Dr. Reed, if you truly have the credentials, prove it. Show us something. Anything that proves your education, your experience, your so-called qualifications." His challenge was a strike to the gut, a direct assault meant to expose her vulnerability. Evelyn could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. The audience, the jury, the reporters, all hanging on every word. The clicks of cameras were like the staccato of a ticking clock, the flashbulbs blinding her momentarily. Every pulse of light was a reminder of the public's hunger for blood. For a brief moment, time seemed to slow. The universe seemed to hold its breath, waiting for her to respond. Evelyn remained unmoved, her eyes steady and unblinking, Her body as rigid as the stone floor beneath her. But under the table, her hand curled into a fist. Her body might have been still, but her mind was racing. She knew what he was trying to do. He was pushing her into a corner, daring her to provide proof, daring her to show any sign of weakness. She knew she couldn't give them what they wanted, not because she didn't have the evidence. No, she had it, buried deep in a vault of classified documents that only a select few could access. But it was not her hands that had erased the records. The truth was far more sinister. Any documents proving her true identity had been intentionally wiped from existence by the very government she once served. They were gone, hidden from the world, removed from the system to protect her and the secrets she guarded. Evelyn had never been afraid of the truth. She had never been afraid to reveal who she was, if it were safe. But right now, revealing the truth meant putting everyone at risk. She could tell them the truth, that she was a senior government agent, that the missing records weren't fakes but deliberately expunged to shield her true identity, to protect the classified operations she had been involved in. But if she did, she would be exposing more than herself. She would be exposing a network, a web of covert missions, and a system that had worked in the shadows for years, a system that would crumble under the weight of what she knew. If Evelyn spoke now, if she revealed even a sliver of what she knew, it wouldn't just end her career, it could end everything. The lives of people she had worked with, the missions she had executed, the national security that had been entrusted to her, all of it would be laid bare. Could she bear the weight of that? Could she sacrifice everything, everyone, for the sake of her own survival? Marcus Thorne wasn't done. He pressed further, his voice growing louder, more insistent, cutting through her thoughts like a blade. You don't have a single academic record. You have no certifications to back your claims. No one can verify your past, your education, your entire story. How does someone like you, someone with no qualifications, end up in such a position of power? Who is pulling the strings behind the scenes? Who is responsible for letting you get this far? His words were a direct assault, a question designed to tighten around her throat like a noose. Evelyn sat motionless, her face calm, her composure unbroken. But inside, a storm was raging. She knew she was trapped. The walls were closing in. The lies were building around her like an avalanche. The longer she stayed silent, the harder it would be to control the fallout. But speaking, revealing the truth, would come at an unspeakable cost. If she told the jury the truth about who she really was, about the covert missions she had led, the powerful people who had erased her identity, what would happen? She wasn't just protecting herself. She was protecting everything she had worked for, everything she had sacrificed. She was protecting the fragile balance of national security, the lives of those who had trusted her, and the ongoing missions that could shift the world's balance of power if exposed. If she opened her mouth now, if she said the wrong thing, she could destroy an entire intelligence network to save herself. And yet, despite the weight of the decision, despite the gnawing fear in her gut, Evelyn understood something else. The real battle was not about proving her innocence. It wasn't about answering Thorne's accusations. The real battle was whether or not she could hold her silence, whether she could keep the truth buried long enough to protect everything and everyone that mattered. But how long could she keep quiet? How long could she endure the pressure, the constant assault of questions and accusations? And most importantly, would they let her stay silent for much longer? The clock was ticking. The tension in the courtroom was palpable, stretching out like the taut string of a bow after Marcus Thorne's damning accusation. Every eye in the room, whether jury members, reporters, or spectators, was fixed on Evelyn Reed, waiting for some sign of weakness, a flinch, a shift, a single moment where she might reveal herself to be the fraud they all believed her to be. The outside world raged with fury, the crowd screaming for justice as they saw it. But inside, the atmosphere had grown as cold as ice, thick with the weight of impending judgment. In that frozen moment, Eleanor Vance, Evelyn's lawyer, stood up slowly, with a calm that seemed almost unnerving in the chaos of the courtroom. She adjusted the collar of her jacket and made her way to the podium. Her composure was a stark contrast to the tempest of accusations and drama on the other side of the room. Her voice, though not loud, was strong enough to pierce the silence, demanding attention and respect. The gaps in Dr. Reed's records are not indicators of fraud, as you've been led to believe. No, they are the result of something far more significant, something far more dangerous. A stunned silence swept across the courtroom. The room seemed to hold its breath as the words hung in the air. Even the crowd outside, whose voices had been relentless just moments before, seemed to pause in anticipation. Reporters adjusted their cameras, pens ready, knowing they had just witnessed the opening of an entirely new chapter in this high-stakes drama. Eleanor Vance had just presented a different path, a new angle no one had expected, and that was enough to unsettle everyone. Prosecutor Thorne, his face a mask of disdain, narrowed his eyes at her, immediately ready to strike back. "Miss Vance, what exactly are you insinuating?" he sneered. "Are you suggesting that the government itself is somehow responsible for erasing Evelyn Reed's records? That's absurd, don't you think?" But Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't back down. She stood firm, unshaken, lifting a thick stack of files in her hands and turning to face the jury. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, let me ask you this. Have any of you ever heard of people whose identities have been deliberately erased from official systems? Who holds the power to do that? Who possesses the ability to wipe someone from all public records, all databases, and leave no trace? And more importantly, who has the power to do this without anyone ever questioning it?" A heavy, loaded silence followed, punctuated only by the soft rustling of paper as Eleanor let her words sink in. No one spoke, but everyone in the room knew the answer. The government, the intelligence agencies, the military. These were the forces, the entities with the power to manipulate, erase, and control information, forces that ordinary citizens would never be able to challenge or even touch. It was a truth that made many uneasy, but also one that, once acknowledged, was impossible to ignore. A ripple of whispered conversations began to spread through the room, as if the very air itself was charged with an electric current. The crowd, once so confident in their conviction that Evelyn was a fraud, began to stir. The seeds of doubt had been planted. Those who had held on to their certainty that she was a liar and a thief were now starting to wonder. Could there be more to this story? Could they have been misled? Eleanor, sensing the shift, took a step closer to the jury, her voice deepening, becoming more deliberate, more cutting. The calm she projected was at odds with the fire of her words. If Dr. Reed truly is a fraud, if she truly has been deceiving everyone for all these years, then why has the government not discovered it earlier? Why has no one ever raised questions about her identity, even after all these years working in sensitive and critical roles within important agencies? And most importantly, if her records truly don't exist, if she's just a ghost, then how is she standing here before you at this very moment, fighting for her life? There was a pause. The room grew heavy with the weight of the question. It wasn't just a challenge to the prosecution. It was a challenge to the very foundation of everything they had assumed to be true about Evelyn Reed. How had she managed to slip through all the cracks, avoid detection for so long, if she was nothing but a fraud? How could someone without a past or any records end up in such powerful positions that would have surely required intense scrutiny and background checks? The silence in the courtroom was oppressive. Prosecutor Thorne clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing as the realization hit him like a punch in the gut. Eleanor had done what he feared most. She had planted a seed of doubt in the jury's mind. In just a few moments, she had flipped the narrative, turning the tide in a way that Thorne hadn't anticipated. The questions she raised weren't just uncomfortable, they were dangerous. They challenged everything about the case, and they threatened to dismantle the carefully constructed image of Evelyn Reed as a fraud. This was no longer just about proving her innocence. It was about questioning everything the jury had been told up until now. For Thorne, that was the most dangerous thing that could happen in a courtroom. The seeds of doubt, once planted, could grow into something far more dangerous than he had ever imagined. It could unravel his case, make everything he had worked for crumble. And in that moment, he knew that the real battle wasn't going to be over evidence or testimony. It was going to be about perception, and that was a battle he wasn't sure he could win. The courtroom still echoed with Eleanor Vance's defense, but Evelyn Reed could no longer hear the details clearly. Her mind had drifted back to a past that no one in that room could even begin to imagine. They thought she was a fraud. They believed she had fabricated an entire identity to achieve success. They knew nothing. Her breathing slowed as the memories pulled her back to Camp Epsilon, a place that wasn't marked on any map, surrounded by dense forests and guarded by people whom the world would never know. Camp Epsilon, a covert facility where the CIA trained its most elite agents, a place where those chosen didn't just have to overcome physical challenges but had their old identities erased and became shadows who existed on no official records. Evelyn recalled the first time she set foot there, a young girl full of ambition but also filled with doubt. They had brought her down from a helicopter in the middle of the night, her eyes blindfolded, her hands loosely tied, not because she was a prisoner, but because that was the first test. In the darkness, the deep voice of her trainer had echoed in her ear. Forget the name Evelyn Reed. Forget everything you've ever known. If you want to survive, if you want to become one of us, you will have to disappear. And she did disappear. Bit by bit, Evelyn Reed was erased. She didn't just learn about intelligence. She learned how to think like a ghost, a person who could blend into a crowd without being noticed, a person who could step into an entirely new life without leaving any trace of the past. They taught her things that an ordinary person would never be allowed to know. How to infiltrate enemy systems without leaving a footprint, how to erase an identity with just a line of code, and most importantly, how to exist without an official identity. The brutal training pushed her body to its limits. Hours submerged in water to learn how to control her breath. Long days left stranded in a forest with no food, no map, only one task. Find your way back without being detected. And the sleepless nights, psychological torture, just to see how long she could endure before revealing anything. Evelyn had watched her fellow trainees fall, some eliminated in the first week, others vanishing without a trace because they didn't have what it took. But she stood firm. She survived. She didn't just have real credentials. She had skills that no one in that courtroom could even begin to fathom. They could erase her name from all records, but they couldn't erase what she had learned, what she had done, what she had become. But now, sitting in front of hundreds of eyes waiting for a defense from her, Evelyn knew she couldn't say a word. If she spoke, everything she had fought to protect would be destroyed. The top-secret missions she had carried out, the national secrets she had kept hidden, the people she had protected. All of it would be exposed just to prove her innocence before these people. They didn't deserve her sacrifice. Evelyn blinked, returning to the present. Across from her, Prosecutor Thorne was still staring, waiting for a rebuttal, an acknowledgement, a moment of loss of control. But Evelyn didn't give him that. The accusations poured down on Evelyn like a hailstorm, each word from the prosecutor striking her with the coldness of ice. But she remained seated, motionless as a statue. Each statement from Thorne was followed by nods of agreement from the jury, murmurs of approval from the audience, and increasingly sharp gazes fixed on her. She could feel the pressure mounting, an invisible force trying to crush her, compelling her to speak. But she couldn't. If she spoke, she could save herself, but the cost would be a series of events beyond her control, a political storm that could engulf the innocent people she had sworn to protect. She scanned the courtroom, trying to maintain her composure, not allowing her emotions to overtake her reason. But then her gaze stopped. In the back row, amidst the angry crowd and the incessant flashbulbs, was her mother, Helen Reed, sitting there silently weeping. Her mother's face was etched with pain and despair. She couldn't understand why her daughter wasn't standing up for herself, why she sat there in silence as if guilty, why she allowed the entire world to turn its back on her without uttering a word. Evelyn's chest tightened. All she had done, all the sacrifices she had made, were for people like her mother, to keep them safe from forces they should never know. But now it was her mother who was suffering the most because of Evelyn's silence. Evelyn's throat felt dry, and her hands clenched so tightly that her knuckles turned white. A part of her wanted to stand up, to shout the truth to everyone, to prove to her mother that she wasn't a fraud, that she had never lied, that she had fought for this country in ways no one could ever imagine. But she knew that if she did that, there would be no turning back. The secrets she held were not just about her. They were about others, agents operating in the shadows, missions still in progress, secrets that could alter the course of the world. If she spoke, who would pay the price? Who would have to sacrifice because of her decision? Beside her mother, a reporter was quietly capturing this moment, the camera pointed directly at Helen Reed's tear-streaked face. Evelyn saw the image reflected on the large screen outside the courtroom, a mother in agony, watching her daughter be buried under accusations from the world. She couldn't bear to see it, but she couldn't do anything to change it. Standing at the crossroads between her own freedom and the safety of others, she knew what she had to choose. Evelyn closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and then opened them again, her gaze unwavering, more resolute than ever. She would not speak. She would not betray what she had fought to protect, even if the entire world was against her, even if her own mother suffered because she didn't understand the truth. Evelyn would remain silent. But the question lingered in her mind, a question she could not escape. How long could she endure before everything collapsed? The sound of shoes hitting the wooden floor echoed with each step as Simon Holloway, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a perfectly pressed suit, approached the witness stand. His face radiated absolute confidence, as though he already held victory in his hands. Before speaking, he scanned the crowded courtroom, pausing just long enough to make eye contact with the jury, planting an impression of certainty in their minds. Then he turned to nod slightly at Prosecutor Marcus Thorne. Thorne didn't need to ask much. He simply lifted a stack of documents, flicked through a few pages to add some drama, and then fixed his gaze on the witness. Mr. Holloway, according to your testimony, Evelyn Reed claimed to have worked at the National Security Research Institute, where you were once the executive director. So I ask you, do you have any records confirming that Miss Reed worked at your organization? Simon Holloway didn't hesitate for a second. His voice rang out clearly. Each word emphasized exactly where the prosecutor wanted it to be. None. Evelyn Reed has never worked at my organization. She completely fabricated that story. That assertion landed like a spark in a room full of gasoline. The crowd erupted. Some people yelled in anger. Others shook their heads, visibly disappointed. The reporters didn't miss the moment, pens scribbling faster, headlines already forming. New evidence exposes the fraud. Evelyn Reed never held any job. The truth revealed. Everything was a lie. On the defendant's bench, Evelyn Reed gripped the edge of the table, her nails digging into her palms so hard they almost drew blood. She had expected these kinds of accusations. She knew they would try to tear her apart piece by piece, dragging her through the mud in front of the world. But knowing it would happen didn't make it easier to bear. She wanted to refute it. She wanted to stand up and tell them that she had worked there, that she had walked into that building every day, that she had handled projects even he didn't know about. But she couldn't, because everything she had done was in the shadows, with no trace, no official record. If she spoke, she wouldn't just harm herself. She would force the government to step in to protect their secrets, and that would only make things worse. Evelyn bit down on her lip, forcing her face to show no emotion. But she could feel the rage boiling inside her chest, a sense of helplessness weighing on her like a boulder. Simon Holloway continued, as if hammering the final nail into the coffin they had prepared for her. I've reviewed all the personnel records at the National Security Research Institute. Every staff list, every employment contract, every data entry. There is no record of anyone named Evelyn Reed ever working for us. No trace, no information. And I'm certain that if someone like her existed, I would have been the first to know. Once again, the courtroom descended into chaos. The murmurs grew louder. The eyes turned to Evelyn, now filled with suspicion. The jury exchanged glances, some furrowing their brows, others even nodding at Holloway's testimony. Thorne, still cool and collected, turned to Evelyn with a faint, mocking smile. Miss Reed, he said, his voice slow and deliberate. Do you have anything to say in your defense? Evelyn stared directly into his eyes. A heavy silence filled the room, and everyone waited for her response. But she knew that if she spoke, even the smallest mistake could cause everything to collapse. If she completely denied it, they would ask for proof. If she chose to remain silent, they would take it as an admission of guilt. And if she revealed even a fraction of the truth, she would endanger many lives. She swallowed her anger, took a deep breath, and then chose the only option available to her in that moment: silence. The atmosphere in the courtroom grew even more suffocating, with each word from Simon Holloway tightening around Evelyn like an invisible noose. His testimony had already cornered her, pushing her further into a dark space. But the next blow came from a witness she knew would make everything worse. Prosecutor Marcus Thorne stood slowly, walking toward the witness stand, his eyes scanning the jury as though victory was already within his grasp. Ladies and gentlemen, to ensure we have a complete picture of the defendant, I call to the stand Dr. Julian Croft, an expert in academic records verification. From below, an older man with neatly groomed silver hair and thick glasses stepped onto the stand. He was a leading expert in identity verification and academic records, known for exposing many cases of falsified degrees in politics and business. The name Dr. Croft was familiar to the media, and his presence here today was almost a death sentence for anyone trying to hide their past. Thorne didn't waste any time with pleasantries. He simply raised a thick file, flipping through a few pages as if adding some dramatic tension, before addressing Dr. Croft. Can you inform the jury of the results of your investigation into Evelyn Reed's academic background? Dr. Croft nodded, opened the file, and when he spoke, his voice was firm, as though the truth had been engraved in stone. After conducting a thorough review of all the universities Miss Reed claimed to have attended, including Harvard, MIT, and Johns Hopkins University, we found no records that indicate she was ever enrolled or graduated. No student records, no transcripts, no confirmations from the universities. The statement landed like a knife in an already fragile situation. A wave of shock rippled through the courtroom. Some reporters almost couldn't believe what they were hearing, hastily scribbling down every word to get the next headline ready. In the crowd, a few people began mocking. "Well, look at that. She called herself a genius," a man yelled out, and a few others laughed derisively. "What a top-tier fraud." Evelyn sat still, but beneath the table, her fingers tightened so much that her nails nearly dug into her skin. She had known this moment would come, but knowing it didn't make it any easier to bear. Because they didn't know that she had graduated. She didn't just have real degrees, but she was one of the top students in international security and data encryption. But all of that had been erased by the government. Her identity, her records, her entire life before she entered the world of intelligence had been wiped from the system, leaving no trace behind. She remembered the moment, years ago, when her superior handed her a file with a single line, "Read, from now on, you do not exist in any public record. You've chosen this path, and you cannot turn back." Evelyn had accepted those terms without hesitation. She knew she would never be able to use her real degrees to apply for a regular job. She would never be able to live a normal life like everyone else. But at that time, she didn't care. She chose to become a ghost to protect the secrets that others shouldn't know. And now the price was being demanded. Prosecutor Thorne looked at her, a slight smirk curling on his lips. "Dr. Reed," he emphasized the word doctor with a hint of sarcasm, "do you care to explain why there are no records of you ever attending college? Or are you planning to remain silent again?" The room held its breath, everyone waiting for her response. Evelyn looked directly into Thorne's eyes. She could feel the weight of hundreds of gazes on her, the reporters waiting for a statement that could become a sensational headline the next day. But she knew she couldn't speak the truth. If she admitted she had attended those universities, they would ask why there were no records. If she said her records were erased, they would demand to know who did it. If she said the government concealed her identity, they would want to know why the government would need to do that. And each answer would lead to consequences she could not predict. Evelyn took a deep breath, forcing her voice to remain calm. "I have nothing to say." The crowd erupted in fury once more, but Thorne only smirked, as though he had achieved exactly what he wanted. He turned to the jury, his voice filled with triumph. "No evidence, no records, no reasonable explanation. I think we all know what that means." Evelyn sat still, feeling every word as if it were a knife slicing into her. She had been trained to endure brutal interrogations, to hold her ground even when tortured. But this was not an interrogation in a dark CIA room. This was a public trial where she was being smeared, dragged into an impossible position. But even with her back against the wall, she would not give in. The night had fallen outside, but the city remained aglow with bright neon lights. Yet for Evelyn, everything seemed to fade into the background. She sat in the temporary apartment her lawyer had arranged, a small, simple room with nothing special about it, just a bed, a desk, and a window overlooking the bustling streets below. An anonymous place for a person who was gradually becoming the most hated name in America. The phone on the desk vibrated, displaying an unknown number. Evelyn stared at it for a moment before slowly picking it up, bringing it to her ear. "Evelyn Reed." The voice on the other end was slow, deep, and full of authority. "Miss Reed, this is Victor Sterling. We're monitoring the case." Evelyn immediately recognized the name. Victor Sterling, a high-ranking official at the CIA, someone she had heard of but never directly communicated with. A person capable of calling off an entire operation with a single command. If he was calling her now, it meant the CIA had truly intervened. She tightened her grip on the phone, keeping her voice steady. Is that so? I guess you have something you want to tell me. There was a long pause on the other end, followed by a sigh from Sterling. Miss Reed, you're well aware of the current situation. But remember this, we cannot intervene unless it's absolutely necessary. Evelyn chuckled softly, but inside, anger surged within her. What do you mean? You're going to let me be dragged through the mud in front of the entire country? Let me be convicted as a fraud when all I've done is serve you. Sterling remained calm, as if he had anticipated her reaction. You know how this organization operates. We cannot confirm or deny anything in public. If we step in, it means we'd have to disclose information that no one wants made public. Evelyn closed her eyes, trying to stay calm, but in her mind, one thought dominated. They were ready to abandon her to protect their secrets. She had once been a loyal agent, willing to do anything for the mission. But now, when she needed them most, they were standing back, watching her struggle to see if she could handle it on her own. So what happens if I lose the case? Her voice turned cold. Will you leave me to be convicted? Another long pause. Then Sterling replied, his voice unwavering. If things get out of control, we will act. But until then, you have to protect yourself. Evelyn scoffed bitterly. Protect myself with what? With an identity that's been erased? With evidence you've hidden? I have nothing to fight them with, and you know that. You're smart, Reed, Sterling replied, his tone still unsettlingly calm. You'll figure it out. The call ended shortly after, leaving Evelyn sitting silently in the dark room, the phone still in her hand. The anger inside her seemed to ignite, burning fiercely. She had given her life to this organization, but when she needed them most, they hid in the shadows, watching her like a mouse in a maze. They wanted to see if she could find a way out on her own. And if she failed, they'd simply wash their hands of it, letting her bear the consequences alone. Evelyn stared out the window into the night. If they wouldn't help her, she would find a way to save herself. But she also knew one thing. If the CIA ever truly had to intervene, it would mean everything had gone so wrong it was beyond their control. The atmosphere in the courtroom had never been more suffocating. Prosecutor Marcus Thorne entered with an air of absolute confidence, as if he already held the victory in his hands. He knew the public was on his side, that every word he spoke would be twisted by the media to shape Evelyn Reed into the perfect example of a fraud. And he was exploiting that to the fullest. Thorne rose, his sharp gaze sweeping over the jury before he spoke with commanding authority. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is not just an ordinary case. This is a deliberate fraud, meticulously orchestrated, a conspiracy to deceive the entire legal and national security system. If we do not impose a severe sentence, we are sending a message that anyone can fabricate a false identity and use it to climb into positions of power. He paused, letting his words sink in, then continued. Evelyn Reed has turned herself into an icon, but not one worthy of admiration. She is the fraud of the century. The moment those words left his mouth, the courtroom erupted. The murmurs, the nods of approval, the angry stares from the crowd outside, all eyes turned to Evelyn. Reporters scrambled to capture the moment, hastily typing out sensational headlines for the front page. Evelyn Reed, the fraud of the century. Her life is a scam. America has been deceived for years. Evelyn sat still in the defendant's chair, her eyes quickly scanning the crowd before settling on the massive LED screens outside the courthouse that were broadcasting the trial live. Her face was now a symbol of hatred across the nation. She was no longer Evelyn Reed. She was just a pawn on the political chessboard. Thorne continued, his voice echoing throughout the courtroom. We are not just dealing with a fake. We are defending the integrity of this system. If today we let her go free, how many more Evelyn Reeds will appear? How many others will think they can create a fake identity, erase their past, and rise to power without anyone being able to touch them? He turned and pointed directly at Evelyn, as though she were the root of all societal problems. Today we have the chance to say no to lies, and I believe you will do the right thing. Those words struck deep into the psyche of the jury and the public watching the trial. Evelyn could feel the rage of the crowd rising, even though she couldn't respond. Because they didn't want the truth, they just needed someone to blame. Her lawyer, Eleanor Vance, quietly clenched her fist under the table. But Evelyn knew she understood. This battle was no longer about evidence or law. It had become a battle for public opinion. And in that battle, she was losing. She could see it in the media. Every news program was feeding into the image of her as the villain. They didn't care about the truth. They just needed a story to sell. And Evelyn knew if she didn't do something soon, they would crush her. Outside the courthouse, the atmosphere remained chaotic, with hundreds of angry people holding signs high, shouting for justice as they understood it. Inside, the air was thick and suffocating. Prosecutor Marcus Thorne had just finished his sharp, pointed speech, and the jury seemed to have already sided with him. Evelyn Reed sat there motionless, but inside, a storm was raging. She knew that if nothing changed, she would lose. But at that moment, a court official rushed quickly to the judge's bench, holding a large envelope sealed tightly. Judge Arthur Finch frowned as he took the envelope. The entire courtroom fell silent. All eyes focused on him. No one knew what was inside, but everyone could feel it. It was important. Finch used a small knife to cut the seal, then slowly pulled out a thick dossier with top secret stamped in bright red on the cover. He quickly glanced at Victor Sterling, who sat quietly in the back row. Sterling didn't say a word but nodded slightly, as if confirming that Finch should read it immediately. Finch turned to the first page, and in a matter of seconds, his face turned pale, his lips pressed tightly together. His eyes scanned each line with a mix of astonishment and growing tension. He swallowed hard, his hand gripping the file as if it had just changed his entire understanding of the trial. All eyes in the room were on the judge, but no one dared speak. Prosecutor Thorne furrowed his brow, growing impatient. "Your Honor, do we not have the right to know the contents of that document?" Finch did not respond immediately. He continued reading, his eyes growing wider as he flipped through each page. At some point, he stopped, took a deep breath, and then slowly set the file down. After several long seconds of silence, which felt like an eternity, he looked up at Evelyn Reed. But his gaze was now completely different. Before, his expression had been full of seriousness and skepticism, but now it had shifted to something almost horrified. Evelyn knew he had understood. He had seen what she could not say. He now knew why her records had disappeared, why no one could verify her identity, and most importantly, who she really was. The courtroom was filled with tension, and the jury began to murmur among themselves. Thorne could no longer wait, slamming his hand down on the table. "Your Honor, we need to know." Finch cut him off, his voice hoarse. "This document cannot be made public." That declaration hit the courtroom like a bomb. The crowd immediately erupted into chaos. The jury exchanged confused glances, and Thorne was pale, as though struck by a blow he didn't understand. He stepped forward quickly. "What do you mean? This is a public trial, and the evidence." "Enough." Finch slammed the gavel down on the table, his eyes still not leaving Evelyn. His tone no longer held the firmness it once had. Instead, there was caution, almost reluctance. He turned to the court official. "We need a closed session immediately. The trial is temporarily adjourned." Evelyn saw Prosecutor Thorne clench his fist. He didn't understand what was happening, but he knew the situation had just shifted, and not in the direction he wanted. As for her, for the first time during the entire trial, she felt like she had regained some semblance of control. But that didn't mean she was safe. Because if the document had caused Judge Finch to react with such horror, it meant everything had just become more dangerous than ever. The courtroom was heavy with silence as Judge Arthur Finch returned to the bench. Before him lay the top-secret dossier sent from the CIA, and despite reading it multiple times, his face still could not conceal the shock it had caused. The air in the room was so suffocating that it felt as if no one dared to breathe too loudly. Prosecutor Marcus Thorne remained seated, but his hand gripped the pen on the table tightly, his eyes fixed on the judge, waiting for what was about to unfold. Finch slowly took the gavel, striking it once on the table, then spoke, no longer with doubt but with absolute certainty. "After reviewing the evidence provided by federal agencies, the court has concluded that the fraud charges against defendant Evelyn Reed are based on a false assumption." A shock wave rippled through the courtroom. The crowd immediately erupted into murmurs, gasps of disbelief, and whispers of astonishment. Reporters scrambled to take notes, while some rushed out of the room to deliver the news as fast as possible. The jury exchanged glances, some of them unable to contain the astonishment on their faces. But Finch did not stop there. He took a deep breath before continuing, his eyes fixed on the jury and the public. "The defendant, Evelyn Reed, is indeed a senior government agent involved in highly classified operations, with her identity protected by the highest levels of U.S. intelligence agencies. All records related to her have been erased as part of the security procedures to protect national intelligence operations. The declaration hit the courtroom like a bomb, exploding right in the center of the room. Everyone froze for a few seconds before the air shattered into uncontrollable chaos. Some people screamed, others gasped in anger, and a few were left stunned, unsure of how to react. For months, America had viewed Evelyn as a fraud, yet now the truth had turned everything upside down. Prosecutor Thorne paled, hurriedly flipping through his documents as though hoping to find some loophole in the judge's statement. But there was nothing. He had built the entire case on a false assumption that Evelyn Reed was an imposter, a liar. But the truth was, she had never lied. Evelyn remained seated in the defendant's chair. She wasn't surprised. She had known the truth would eventually come out, but she never imagined it would unfold this way. She looked directly at Thorne, and for the first time since the trial began, she saw him falter. Outside the courthouse, the latest news flashed across the giant screen. Evelyn Reed, CIA agent. Shocking revelation. Has America been misled? From the fraud of the century to a secret hero. Evelyn exhaled slowly, but she knew this was far from over. The truth had come to light, but that didn't mean everyone would accept it. The courtroom was buzzing with tension as Evelyn Reed left, now under the gaze of hundreds of people. But this time, the eyes weren't filled with just anger or contempt. America was divided. Outside the courthouse, heated debates erupted. Half of the public praised Evelyn as a hero, a special agent who had sacrificed her identity, personal life, and even her future to serve her country. They called her the woman in the shadows, someone whom America owed an apology. On social media, hashtags like Evelyn Reed Hero and The Truth Revealed quickly became trending topics. Major media outlets began reporting that Evelyn was not a fraud, but rather a victim of an incompetent bureaucratic system. But the other half of the public refused to believe it. They claimed Evelyn Reed was merely avoiding justice by hiding behind an unverified CIA identity. They saw it as a diversion tactic, that the government had manipulated everything to help her escape conviction. Online forums were flooded with posts under titles like, "No agent, just a fraud being protected." Small protests began to spring up with signs demanding a fairer investigation. Though the truth had come to light, Evelyn remained trapped between two conflicting waves of public opinion. Meanwhile, prosecutor Marcus Thorne was facing the worst nightmare of his career. Immediately after Judge Arthur Finch announced Evelyn Reed as a protected CIA agent, an internal investigation was launched to examine how Thorne had handled the case. He had spent months building a case based on false information, manipulating the media to turn Evelyn into a monster in the eyes of the public. But now it was Thorne who was being exposed. Articles that once hailed Thorne as a defender of justice now turned against him. Television channels that had eagerly broadcasted news of the fraud of the century were now forced to retract. But this did nothing to ease Thorne's growing public backlash. The jury felt deceived. Witnesses who had previously accused Evelyn were now being questioned. Had they been manipulated? Were they victims of a dirty media campaign? The tipping point came when a series of internal emails were leaked, showing that Thorne had known about Evelyn's potential CIA involvement beforehand, yet still pushed the case forward to serve his own interests. He didn't care about the truth. He just wanted a win to bolster his political career. And now he had to pay. In just a week, Thorne was suspended. Partners who had once supported him quickly distanced themselves, unwilling to be involved in such a major scandal. When a reporter caught him outside his office to ask about his reaction, Thorne no longer had his usual confidence. He avoided the question, refused to comment, his face pale. Those who had publicly defamed Evelyn Reed began to face consequences as well. Journalists who had written scathing articles about her were now facing a wave of criticism from their readers. Some had to publicly apologize, while others were fired for ethical violations after failing to fact-check their information. The TV channels that had repeatedly aired defamatory reports about Evelyn began to lose credibility, and some of the heads of media organizations were forced to resign. Justice had been restored, but at what cost? Though Evelyn's reputation had been cleared, she could never regain the life she once had. She couldn't return to a normal life, couldn't simply leave and live in seclusion. From a ghost in the world of intelligence, she had been pulled into the light, and even though the truth had been acknowledged, she would always be watched, always the name that made people suspicious. Evelyn Reed had won this battle, but this was not a glorious victory. It was a victory filled with loss. Evelyn Reed stood alone on the hotel balcony, her figure silhouetted against the glow of Washington, D.C.'s neon lights. The city below buzzed with activity, the steady hum of traffic and distant chatter weaving into the night. But for Evelyn, the world felt distant, muted. The city that had once felt so familiar now felt foreign. Her victory in the trial had brought her some relief, but it had also irrevocably changed her. She was no longer the ghost she had once been, no longer hiding in the shadows. But there was no place for her in the light either. She stood there, staring out into the void, when the phone in her pocket vibrated. The screen displayed an unlisted number. Evelyn paused, her breath steady, before slowly lifting the phone to her ear. Evelyn Reed. The voice on the other end was calm, collected, and too familiar. Victor Sterling, the man who held power over her life in ways she could never forget. We have a mission for you. Are you ready to come back? Her heart tightened at his words, the weight of the question sinking in. She had known this day would come. She had known that her time of freedom was fleeting, that the CIA would never truly let her go, no matter the outcome of the trial. The victory in court had been a brief reprieve, a mere blip in a much larger narrative that was still unfolding. Evelyn's voice was steady when she responded, though the feeling in her chest was anything but. What kind of mission? Top secret, Sterling replied. She could hear the weight in his voice, the implication of something dangerous, something that could once again drag her back into a life she had tried to leave behind. She didn't need further explanation. She knew exactly what it meant, a mission that didn't exist on paper, a mission that, if she failed, would erase her from the world's memory, a mission where her very existence would be denied. Her identity, once again wiped clean from the system. There would be no trace of Evelyn Reed. She would vanish, just as she had before. Evelyn didn't answer right away. She turned away from the balcony, her gaze falling on her reflection in the window. She saw a face that no longer resembled the woman who had once walked out into the world full of hope and ambition. The years had aged her, the secrets had marked her. But more than anything, the choices she had made had reshaped her. She stared into her own eyes and saw two paths stretching before her, each more daunting than the last. One path led to a normal life, a life where she could disappear, where she could erase her past, change her name, and live in peace, away from the dangerous world she had been part of for so long. She could go somewhere quiet, somewhere no one knew her name. She could build something new, something untouched by the betrayal, the lies, the judgment. She could finally find freedom in anonymity. The other path led her back into the darkness, back to the CIA's grip, back to missions that would consume her, where danger awaited her at every turn, and where her identity, what little of it was left, would again be a tool in a game she could never control. It was a path that would steal her freedom in exchange for serving the very people who had abandoned her when she needed them most. But it was a path that, for someone like Evelyn, would always call to her. Her fingers tightened around the phone. She wasn't surprised. She knew this moment would come, and yet it felt like an impossible choice. The screen went black, leaving her in the silence of her own thoughts. A question echoed in her mind, a question that would haunt her no matter what choice she made. If you were Evelyn, what would you choose? A flicker of doubt lingered in her mind, but there was no time for hesitation. She had lived her life in shadows, but now, with the truth in the open, the question of who she really was had never been clearer. Don't forget to hit subscribe to follow the next thrilling stories.